What's going on? I'm John, and in this writing vlog, I'm going to be naming all of the things. Up until now, I have been procrastinating naming things for my epic fantasy novel. I've had characters named Prince 1, I've had a continent named Continent X, but as I'm getting closer to starting my first draft, I'm realizing that I don't want to be using placeholders. I want to figure out the real name. So that is what I'm going to be doing in this video. I'm going to be naming all of the most important places, the locations, the cities, the geographical features, continents, countries, all of that stuff. I'm also going to be focusing on naming characters, all of the main and supporting characters across the 3 different character arcs, and maybe I'll even name a few things too, just to get all the nouns covered. Okay, so I came over here and I created a basic series and first novel. I know my names are so creative. Epic Fantasy 1 and Book 1. I'm gonna get awards for those. But I just wanted to get started getting the basic setup here in Plottr, and I'm going to come in here in Plottr and I'm going to figure out some of these basic places and some of the characters and naming for them. Basically what you can do is you can put your character bibles or whatever here. You can create categories for the different types of characters, and you can create categories for different places and stuff like that. Put whatever notes you want or attributes or any of that stuff. As far as actually doing the naming, I'm going to rely on something that I learned from the research of the world building like Brandon Sanderson video. Basically, the way that he talked about coming up with names is through relying on a language of a Earth world culture. So I'm going to do this as well. However, I do want my names to sound different. I don't want them to sound so familiar. So I don't want to follow really well-known naming structures like you might think about with certain European languages or East Asian languages that have known cultures. For instance, Chinese, Japanese, or Korean names. I think a decent amount of people would actually recognize those names. Maybe I'm overestimating it because I know the differences between those names and I can recognize them. Either way, I do want it to feel very foreign, so I don't want to pick some sort of naming that would feel familiar to most readers, or at least most American readers. That's how I'm going to be doing the naming. I'm going to be following what Brandon Sanderson has advised, and I'm going to be looking through languages and cultures and trying to find some naming structures that I think would be interesting and that would fit the different cultures of my world. Okay, so I was looking at my map here, and I know that there's 4 countries that are going to have at least different cultures. Actually, there's 5 technically, because one of the countries was conquered. So their culture and their naming is still going to be, occurring. It's just going to happen inside of this other country, and it might get influenced by the other country's culture a little bit as well. So I need at least 5 different naming styles here. I already looked through a bunch of different languages. For example, some of the languages that I thought had interesting sounding names were Romanian, Somali, Javanese, Zulu, Kazakh, Hungarian, Greek, and Afrikaans. So I'm going to pick a subset of these to use as the influences for the different naming styles in these different countries, and those naming styles will be applied to characters from those countries as well as places. So that is what I'm going to be doing right now. Okay, so I was figuring out the language roots for these different countries, basically. So this is how it's kind of working out. This central country, which is occupying this territory, they're going to have a naming rooted in Romanian sort of language. This southern country is going to have naming rooted in sort of a Greek sounding kind of language. This western country is going to have naming rooted in like an Afrikaner sort of sounding language, and this northern country is going to have naming rooted in a Somali language. This little sort of conquered territory, sorry to the language owners, but it's going to have naming similar to like a Hungarian sort of language. I haven't figured out the naming for these continents yet. I think it will be somewhat relevant, especially if we end up with the characters that are in this country, because they are going to have easy trade access to both of these countries, since they have warm waters and they're close to both of them. These might actually have multiple countries within them, but we'll see. I mean, some of the islands might be separate countries and whatnot, but I don't know about those details yet. The main thing is that I figured out some of the naming, like language roots for these countries. So now that I have that, I can actually come up with names for some of these places in the countries. I do need to name the continents themselves as well. I'm still kind of feeling like putting it off. I have no idea what these continents are going to be named at all. But this continent right now is called X continent. I know. Amazing. Anyway, so now I can name some of the more important locations within these countries. Also, I need to name the countries themselves too. Okay, so I was just looking into naming of countries specifically because I have at least 4 countries to name and potentially 5 right now. And doing some research, I found that countries are mostly named after 4 things. And I thought this was an interesting detail that might be useful to other people working on this process. Basically, countries are named after some sort of tribe or ethnic group. So they're named after a sort of people. They're named after a location. So whether they're on the east, the west, the center, whatever. They're named after a person, some specific famous person in the country's history, or maybe there was some sort of exploration where that country was found and named by other people, and those people named the country after some famous person in their culture. And then the last way the countries are named is after some sort of characteristic feature of the country, whether it's some sort of already named physical feature or location, like a lake or mountain or something, or whether it's just generally the geography of the country. So that is how countries are named. And now I have to name some countries. Okay, so I technically just finished naming the countries, although some of them are harder to read than others. It's kind of a balance because the more different that a language and name in general looks, the more fantastical it can feel. At the same time, you do want things to be readable. I do have some pretty readable names. I think that some of them are more readable than others. Like one of them is really readable, kind of has a Germanic sort of feel even. Nelwes, very readable, very easy. There's also Mareradu, very readable, I think. And then we started to get into the less readable stuff. This one, I still haven't figured out which one I'm going to name it, but there's either Didikdul or Kumadul. Both of those are pretty cool. I'm not sure which one I like better though. And then here's where we get to the harder to read ones. We have Megayakti. It's not spelled the way it sounds, at least not, English spelling. And then this is the hardest one, Temiken. Try to pronounce my own freaking country's name. So those are the names of the different countries that we have on this central continent, the well-named continent, Continent X, of course. So next I'm going to actually start naming some of the places within these countries, the capital cities, the most important cities, the biggest cities, and that kind of thing. I'm not going to focus on naming small towns or anything yet because, well, first of all, I don't need to know the names of those small towns unless somebody actually goes there, or I plan on somebody actually going there. So I'm not going to worry about naming them yet, but I will name some of the bigger cities since they might be talked about in like news or, events that happen in the story. The news of them might spread from a certain city or whatever. I do want to name the larger cities in these various countries. So I'm going to go back to the naming drawing board. This is actually like really fun because I like languages in general. So being able to like look up these languages and be like, oh, this place is called like, fertile territory or whatever, fertile land. And this place is named after this famous, guy who guided all these people across a desert and mountains, there's some pretty cool things you can come up with the names. I could see that it would be easy for me to really just go deep into these names, but I'm going to hold myself back and I'm just going to focus on the most important stuff to name. Let's just get into it. Let's name some places, some capital cities, some large cities, and maybe some terrain features or whatever. Okay, so I'm looking at the cities that I have to name here. I still have 3 places to name in Megayakti. I have 2 places to name in Nelwes. I have 3 places to name in probably Dirikdul. Still haven't figured out which one I want to pick. Anyway, I have 3 places to name there. So let's get started on getting some of these done. I'm going to start with Megayakti. so I just finished up on the 3 cities of Megayaki. We got 3 cities there. Now I'm going to work on the 2 Noa cities, and then I'm going to work on the 3 up north. So I just finished up naming all the major cities on the continent. Took a while. I've got, what is this, like 11 cities? That includes the 4 capitals and 1 former capital. So I've got the cities, I've got the countries. I'm gonna quickly name some geographical locations as well. Here, I'll show you. These main 2 mountain ranges, the desert, this forest, and the 2 rivers. So those are the locations that I'm going to focus on naming real quick. It's going to take a little bit of time, but once I've got those done, I'm not going to worry about the, maybe I should do the oceans and seas too. Oh, I may or may not name at least some oceans as well. Okay. So I just finished naming all of the places, at least the ones that I'm going to name right now. I have the continents too, but I don't know what I want to call any of the 3 of them. So for right now, they're just continent X and then northwest and southwest continents. Am I just being lazy? I might actually just go on my run right now because, wow, okay, maybe it's because I'm hungry. It's already 10 o'clock and I haven't gone on my run yet. I'm gonna have some breakfast when I get back from that, but it's getting kind of late. Maybe that's why I'm feeling a little lazy and not wanting to name these things. Or maybe it's just because naming takes a long time. Like, this is no joke, man. I'm gonna quickly go and do that run actually, because yeah, I think I am gonna get pretty hungry here. Then I'll come back and eat some breakfast and all that, and I will be back to name some more stuff. So since my runs / walks are getting a little bit longer, I'm trying to figure out a trail that's a little bit better, because my current trail, which is 3 miles and includes a 1 mile loop, on long run days where it ends up being like 6 miles, that means I have to go around the loop so many times. So I'm trying to find something that's a little bit longer, and today I'm trying to create a 2 mile loop. So that's what I'm going to try to find right now. Okay, so I realized that trying to create a 2 mile loop while I was in the process of only running or walking today 4 miles, it's kind of difficult. So I'm going to try and either create a 3 mile or a 4 mile loop today. Tomorrow I can focus on a 2 mile loop because I have 6 miles to play with, so I can definitely find something within that. But wow, I heard a noise in the woods. But anyway, I haven't been on this trail in a very long time, man. Last time I was on this trail was when I was in high school, when I did cross country. Well, I just got back. It was a good 4 mile trail. I had to kind of play around with it to try to get the distance right, but it worked out. I also got to climb a little rope. The ROTC must have put it there or something. Anyway, I am going to take a shower, eat some breakfast, and listen to Words of Radiance and get back to work after that. So where we left off yesterday, I had just gone for a walk and I got back and I ate some breakfast, took a shower, all that good stuff. And I started listening to Words of Radiance. I got a little bit addicted and I listened to the rest of the book. Combined with doing some errands and having to do immersion time, I didn't end up getting back to doing more of this naming. So here I am today, ready to get back and do more of the naming. There was actually one little thing that I did do with regard to the naming, which was basically thinking about the readability for English-speaking readers, you know, American readers mostly. And I was thinking about basically how I can make some of these names more readable for an English-speaking audience. That's because, you know, some of these places that I named, like for instance, some of the cities especially, which I named based on the language of the country and the culture of that country. Some of these names, you know, they're not immediately easy to pronounce if you are an English speaker and you see them spelled in the native language. I mean, I can show you some of these names, like literally. They're freaking impossible to pronounce. I also put some like pronunciation guides in next to them because some of them are just like too freaking impossible to pronounce. The ones like this, like I can't even pronounce it. See, I have to look at the pronunciation. Ditiko Limani, like some names like that. I think that what I need to do is I need to basically go through and basically convert them to English, because this is what happens in languages anyway. When somebody else who is not a native speaker of the language is exposed to a word in that language, they hear it using the sound system of their own native language. So I think what I need to do is basically play the explorer, and if I were to encounter some of these names and I do not understand how to pronounce them, I'm just looking at them as an English speaker and just hearing them as an English speaker, how would I spell them? And by doing that, I can convert some of these harder to pronounce names to something that an English speaker would be more likely to be able to pronounce, and make the reading experience a little easier for people. And also make them easier for me to remember too, because sometimes I'm like, how the heck did I spell that again? So I'm going to convert some of these names to a style that looks more similar to English so that they'll be easier to read. But I may also revamp some of these place names to make them as good as they can be, because I want to make sure that my names are awesome and that this world is a world that people are like, wow, that's really cool. You know, when you just feel like all the elements of the world are just so incredible and it feels like this place that you'd really want to be? Well, that's what I want to create. So basically, I don't want to give a half effort here. I want to do the best I can with creating these names. So I'm going to go through and Englishify, if that's a word, some of these names, as well as go back through and make sure that I'm satisfied with these place names. Okay, so the way I decided to accomplish this English conversion process is basically I created this temporary tag, hard to read, and I'm just going to go through and I'm going to mark all the places that might be difficult for an English speaker to read. And then I'm going to go through all these English speaker difficult to read sorts of names and convert them to something that's a little bit more easy to understand in English, easier to read. So I just finished up converting names that were a little bit difficult to pronounce to something that at least people that are English speakers have seen before. With some of them, in order to keep that foreign sort of feel to them, I did keep some of the sounds that weren't present in English, but that people that speak English might already kind of be used to. But for the most part, I did try to simplify the words and spell them in a way that would make sense to an English speaker. For instance, there was this Hungarian word, and the original spelling is like that. And I tried to change it a little bit. Even though it changes the sound slightly, it makes it easier to pronounce. Erduvaros. Those are the kinds of compromises that I was looking for in order to make these things easier to pronounce and make names that people would actually, understand how to pronounce them. So that is what I'm doing. I am going to continue going through and naming stuff, and specifically I want to go through now and focus on naming continents. I've been avoiding this. I've been avoiding it pretty strongly, but I need to eventually name the main continent for sure, and the other two continents are important to name because I have seas that are named after them. If I don't name them, then I don't know what the names of these seas are, which just leaves me procrastinating more naming further and further off, and I really don't want to do that. I want to name all the things that are important right now so that I don't have to procrastinate naming again. So naming continents was not as easy as you may think. I was struggling with it because I was trying to think about, first of all, what sounds nice, but second, the origins of these names. So for instance, in the continents that we know, they were named by people from a long time ago, basically, and the names may or may not have just come from common usage by sailors and people coming to them often. It's really hard to know how they were named. Some of them, there's some history. Maybe they were named by just the people who discovered them, but even those are kind of contested, so it's difficult to know. And that kind of pulled me into this idea of, well, obviously they would be named in the language that was used in that long ago time. And I realized that the languages that I decided to use as the basis for these different countries are actually not as connected as one might think. And they came from a language a long time ago, but they're not very connected. Basically, the long story short is that these languages do come from an original one, but we don't know what the original one was So I ended up just defaulting to what sounded cool. So that is how I ended up naming the continents, based on meaning and what sounded cool in like the older languages. The country to the south has a history of really accomplished like shipbuilders, so they were able to see these other continents first, so they ended up naming those continents. The other two continents are named in that language, in like the Greek sort of root. The main continent also ended up being named in Greek because the other languages, they didn't have as nice of names. I'm not sure about the history of that, but it sounds nice. What is it? The rule of cool? Anyway, I might be misapplying that rule. So at the very least, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to be naming some of the geographical features on this main continent, which I'm calling Terasti. So some of the things I'm going to focus on naming now, I will show you. So there's marshland over here, so I'm going to name this marshland. I'm going to name this plain here. Did I name the rivers yet? Oh, I did name these rivers. I named both of those rivers already. I'm going to name the islands that are present as well, and then also like some of these seas and bays and whatnot. So that is what I'm going to be doing now. I am going to move to the living room because it's a little bit more comfy. I'm tired of sitting in this desk chair. So let's get moving. Okay, so first of all, there's a thunderstorm going on outside right now. So if you hear any loud noises, that's probably what it is. Basically, what I'm doing right now is I'm going through and I'm trying to label the map actually with names, because I want to make sure that I'm not forgetting any places. I mean, I'm not using some sort of font that is like this perfect font or anything like that. I'm just writing it with my normal open sans, sort of font. So nothing special, but I'm basically just labeling all these different like places. I labeled the continents. I labeled various different oceans and whatnot. And I'm basically just trying to make sure I don't forget stuff. Like for instance, I had forgotten about this marsh here. I'd forgotten about the desert up here. I'm not worrying about labeling cities. I already know what they all are and what corresponds to what, so there's really not a big deal. What I'm focusing on is things that I am forgetting about. So for instance, this island up here, island chain down here, the island chain over here and over here, so various places. And I'm also thinking that I might have to pick a language for these civilizations as well, because I feel like I'm kind of putting off some of the naming that I may or may not need to do anyway. Like for instance, what is this area, this sea called, or bay, or whatever you're going to call it? Like what are these areas called? I don't know what that stuff is going to be called, and I don't necessarily want to name all of it, but at least like the main stuff. I'm thinking that I might just take a little bit of an aside here just to figure out kind of what cultures are there, at least what they speak. And maybe I'll make one of them speak English because it makes my life easy. I already did so many languages. Like, what languages do I have left? I don't know what other sort of language family I could include. I mean, I guess an Asian one. I did look into maybe Java, like Indonesian sort of. So that would be interesting. I did have a few Asian languages that I had chosen, but they didn't really match, because it made sense that the people on this continent would have relatively similar languages. I mean, these people speak Somalian, so it's not exactly the most connected to the other ones, but all the people in the southern part of this continent speak European languages or Indo-European languages. So it would make sense that maybe these people over here, they could speak a different language that's a little bit less connected. I did name these places from the perspective of an explorer from this area, or at least the continents, but then maybe some of the actual names of landmarks and places within the continents will be related to the language spoken by the people that live there. So those are some of the things that I am currently wrestling with in the great naming fiasco. Thunder, yes. It's adding dramatic effect to what I just said. So yeah, I'm going to continue naming some geographical features, and I may or may not figure out a language that is spoken and used in these other two continents so that I can name some of the geographical features on those continents and actually have completed the naming of things in this world, which would be really nice, because I don't want to keep procrastinating naming. I just want to be finished with naming. I want to have everything figured out, and that way I don't have to come back to worrying about all these names or anything like that, or feeling like, oh, I forgot to name that thing, and what if I want to have character refer to it? No, I know what everything is, so if I want to have a character refer to some place, then I'll already know all the names for that, so no big deal. That's the state that I want to get to with these names. I have been naming a lot of things, particularly things on this continent. I decided that they were going to speak a Javanese type sort of language over there. There's various different things that I ended up naming, the mountains and forest and this little island and then this little archipelago, this coast. All of those things were named in that language. And now I have been switching over to getting some of the other islands basically and naming some of the ones that I missed. So for instance, this one I named the tiny little island, and then this little archipelago here I also named. I need to name that island as well. And then I'm going to start naming stuff on this continent. I still have a decent amount of stuff to name, but I'm almost done with naming geographical locations. So I'm going to get back into naming the rest of this stuff here. I'm going to name everything around this other continent and these last few islands surrounding the main continent of Terasti. So I just finished naming most of the important geographical features. So there's various things here, like I finished up naming all of the main geographical features of this continent, as well as I ended up naming this little island, this ocean to the north. Oh, and these plains there. It just calmed down. It stopped raining, so I may actually go for my run right now because I would prefer not to get thunderstormed on, heavily rained on. So I think I'm gonna go to that right now, and when I get back I may or may not start naming some actual characters. I think I might be done with naming places. I'm sure there's going to be some other places that I'll come up with when I'm actually writing the story, but as far as places I can think of right now and places that I can put on a map without making my map like super detailed, this is what I've got. Okay, so I've gotten back from my run. I was just reading Edge Dancer, which is a novella as part of the Stormlight Archive series. Apparently there's some good stuff in here that is going to elaborate a little bit more on this world and the magic and all that stuff. So I'm looking forward to, well, actually I'm already a decent amount of the way through the novella, so I'm like a fifth of the way through, which feels very strange to say for something that Brandon Sanderson wrote, when usually it takes me like a few weeks, 2 weeks maybe, to finish a book. I am going to continue working on naming stuff. I do still want to make sure that I like all of these names and whatnot, and also I want to sort them a little bit better. I want to add more tags because there's so many places. Like if I filter by geographical location, even then I still have a decent amount of places, which means that it's hard to find the ones that I want. So that is what I'm planning to do right now. I'm going to tag things up a little bit, make it easier to find them. And I just remembered that I do actually need to add one more thing. I never added the name of this river. Actually, there's 2 rivers on the Diomieri. There's 2 rivers on this continent, 2 major rivers, and I never named them. And I didn't name this forest up here either. I also missed one of the little rivers on Dio Cormos, and I missed one of the rivers on Terasti. So I still have a few things left to name. I just finished sorting all these, and now I will show you how beautiful it is. So basically, now that I have sorted them out, I can actually go through here and I can say, oh, let's go find some freaking forests or whatever. And I filtered out everything except for forests. Or I want to filter just for like oceans and seas and whatnot. This is a lot of things, to be quite honest. So basically, now that I have sorted all these out, it should be easy to find things, which is going to be necessary when I'm writing. I don't know if there's anything else left for me to do. I have one little thing that's standing out a little bit to me. I have some things that are named in English. There are some things that are actually like legitimately just English. I might change those, even though I like some of the names. Since there's no culture that speaks English in the story, or that it seems to be like descended from English, it doesn't really make sense that there would be purely English names of places. So I have named a lot of things. I changed some of the names a little bit to be consistent. If I'm going to call things some name plus forest, then maybe it makes sense to also, most of the time, call something some name plus mountains or peaks or whatever it is. So I think I've worked out the names as much as I'm going to for now. I think the names are going pretty well for these places. I'm going to check on it again tomorrow, I think, But for now, what I actually want to do is get started on naming characters. And in doing so, I'll be able to actually, give myself a little bit of a break from looking at places, but also I'm going to get to start filling out some character information. So that's going to be fun as well. Okay, so I did come up with a few names for characters, although the only names that I came up with so far are just the main characters' names. I figured out the 3 main characters' names, but tomorrow I'm gonna keep working on names a little bit more. Right now, I gotta go do some immersion, a little bit of Japanese. Okay, so today's immersion is a little bit different. I'm watching this show. It's pretty famous in the West, actually. It's called Terrace House. Basically, it's just kind of this like reality TV show. You follow like 6 people, 3 guys, 3 girls, as they live their lives in this house. Okay, so I'm back here for the 3rd day to continue with naming some more. Yesterday I figured out some naming for some of the characters, specifically the 3 viewpoint characters of the story. But yesterday I was mostly focusing on continuing to name places. I am going to look into places again today. I'm just going to look over and make sure that I like all of the names and that I'm still thinking that all of them are actually good names. Before I actually get into that today, I do want to start working on characters a little bit more. So I created these tags for for the different main characters, and using those, what I'll be able to do is I'll be able to relate the other characters to the main arc that they're involved in, which will make it easier to find characters as well. Before I actually go about naming the characters, I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to create all of them so I know which ones I need to name, and that way I don't forget to name any of them. So I just finished filling out all the characters to make sure I don't actually forget anybody. I have them sorted by different tags or whatever so I can tell who's who. So now I've got my characters and now I just need to fill them out, give them names, and add a little bit of detail about who each person is. So I figured out the main characters in Miksa's character arc. Basically, there's a few characters that I came up with. So next, I want to figure out the names for the characters in the second character's arc. I can't believe it, but I think I forgot her name. Ella. Duh. Okay, so next I'm going to figure out the characters in her character's arc. Let's see, how many are there in the first place? So she only has 5 actually, which is great. Minimizing the total number of characters makes it easier for people, including me. So I'm just going to go about naming these real quick and we'll see what we can do. Okay, so I just finished naming all the characters in this second character's arc and Ella's arc. Oh wait, no, I forgot one. 1 second. Okay, so now I actually finished naming all of the characters as part of Ella's arc. I got the basic names all worked out for these. So next is going to be the difficult one. This is the political arc that has 1 million characters in it. Yeah. So I just finished up with quite a bit of naming. It was a lot of people to name. The hardest part was not necessarily that there were so many people to name, but trying to make sure that the names were unique enough. So I literally had every single person start with a different letter. I'm using up most of the alphabet here. Let's just say that. Anyway, I managed to come up with names that were all of different beginning letters and relatively different sorts of sounds and feels to them. So I named all the people in the royal sort of, or imperial sort of court. So anyway, I finished up with the naming of people. I actually really like all of these names, so I think that the names of people are ready to go. I am going to quickly look back over the names of places just to make sure that I like all of those as well. And then maybe I'll take another look over people after I've, had a little break from looking at it. I just finished looking through all of these place names, and I actually love these names. So I'm just gonna take a little break, eat some breakfast, read Edge Dancer today. I don't have a run, so that's what I'm gonna do, and then I'll come back and I'll talk to you more about these other names, the people names. Okay, so I'm back. It's been a little while. Basically, I was actually working on organizing my world building a little bit better because the way that I had done it, I only just used like a Google Doc and it was fine, but I was finding it was a little bit difficult to navigate even though I had added all these headings and whatnot. So what I'm doing instead is I'm trying to organize it into like a wiki. Anyway, that's not the point of this video. I was working on that and then I realized, oh my god, I still haven't looked over the actual people names again. So I'm going to be doing that right now. I'm going to be reviewing the names of people, making sure that all these names I'm satisfied with, and that I'm actually ready to write this story with these different characters. So I actually really like these names that I came up with for the characters as well. I've already confirmed that I like the places, and I definitely do. So I'm done with naming. This process took way longer than I initially thought it would. If you can believe it, I initially thought that this would take one day to do all the naming of both characters and places. But 5 hours into the first day, I was surprised to realize that I was not close to finishing at all. Even though it did take longer than I expected, it really did help to fill out the world, and adding those labels to the map really added a lot of life to it that I did not expect. Before, I just thought, okay, it's pretty cool. I figured out the geography. I know where the countries are vaguely now. I know what their borders are more or less. So this is cool. But adding names of places and knowing that this place is called that and the names of continents and all that stuff and rivers and all these geographical features really made the world seem more alive. So that was really cool. Also, part of the process that was fun for me is the fact that you're interacting with these languages that already exist in our world. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But I really love languages in general, so going in and trying to figure out what the names would be in this language for a certain town or physical feature of the geography was really cool. So that's my overall feeling about this experience. Now let's just get into a few little things that I think I learned from doing this. Okay, so there were 3 main lessons that I took away from doing this process. The first is to be consistent. You see, when I started off with this process, I was naming things in various ways. For instance, some of my places were named completely in English, some of my places were named completely in the naming language. And this sort of inconsistency, this sort of discrepancy made it feel like the naming wasn't an organic process in the world's history. And when I ended up actually creating consistent rules for how I was doing the naming, for instance with geographic features, I was using 2-part names where we have a name in the actual naming language and then we have a label. So for instance, the so-and-so mountains or whatever. But with cities or with countries, I was using names that were purely in the naming language because you already know it's a country, you know it's a city, you don't need a label afterward. And by being consistent with the way that I was naming things, it ended up making the entire map with all of the labels feel much more congruent, like nothing was out of place. And the second lesson I took away from this was to keep the reader in mind. Most likely, if you're watching this, you are an English speaker yourself and you're writing stories for other English speakers. And this is where keeping your audience in mind comes into play. Because if, for instance, you name things completely in English, then you lose some of that fantastical foreign feel to the names. However, if you name things completely in the naming language, then the reader might not even know what you're talking about. It might be harder for them to recognize what you're referring to, and it might be harder for them to remember what this thing actually is. So by doing what I was talking about before with the 2-part names, you end up having a descriptor which makes the name have that foreign, that fantastical feel to it, as well as a label which makes the name understandable and makes it easier for the reader to associate with things in the story and remember. So long story short, keep your reader in mind with your naming. Make sure that your names give the reader what they want, that different feel, like this is a completely different world. At the same time, make sure you're not confusing your readers and making it so difficult for them to remember all of these different names in languages that they've never even heard of before. that they can't really enjoy your book to its fullest. And the third thing that I took away from this experience was the value of using distinct Earth languages. And what I mean by that is by using languages that already exist but that feel distinct from the language that the reader is coming from. And the reason I like this so much is that it buys you a lot with a relatively small investment. Let's imagine a few different cases here. On one case, you could name everything in the reader's native language. You could write one of those typical fantasies that takes place in an English-speaking world. It's in some sort of area similar to medieval England or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if you're really trying to make it feel different for the reader, like they're in a completely different situation than they're used to, using a language that is completely foreign to them definitely amplifies the experience. And this is something I've noticed while reading the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, because it just feels like this completely different place. And part of that is the naming of characters, and part of that is the naming of places and how different they feel from what you're used to. So part of the great part about using these distinct Earth languages that you get a lot from it, you get this foreign feel to your naming already. But another part that's awesome about it is that it's very easy to do naming in these languages in our modern world. And that is because you can literally search and look up names of people in other languages very easily. And you can also go on Google Translate and get a translation for pretty much any word you want in one of these foreign languages. So if you're not going to be like Tolkien and spend years and years studying linguistics and then create your own language, this is a good compromise to get that foreign feel, to get that foreign element while making a relatively small upfront investment. Also, if you're interested in languages at all in general, this process is very fun. So those are the main lessons that I learned from doing this process. But I'm curious, how do you go about doing naming in your stories? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you like this video, make sure to smash that like button so that YouTube knows to share with other writers like you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I just thought of an expression in English that is a little bit explicit, and then I thought of an expression in Japanese, and I was like, no, I can't say that either. So now I'm trying to think of how to say it in a better way.